When ancient Egypt is mentioned, many people will immediately think of majestic pyramids, the mysterious Sphinx, powerful pharaohs, and the brilliant civilization along the Nile River. But hidden beneath that splendid golden veneer lies a chilling truth. Ancient Egypt was not only an empire of great structures but also a land shrouded in the shadow of horrifying diseases. Imagine over 3,000 years ago, amidst lavish banquets in palaces or grand processions on the banks of the Nile in some hidden corner, thousands of people were moaning in fever, coughing up blood their bodies, covered in sores and their flesh falling away. The mummies that archaeologists unearth today are not just relics of power. They also contain evidence of countless diseases that haunted a seemingly invincible civilization. Disease, the invisible enemy of ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians understood early on that the Nile River was their source of life. The river brought fertile silt, food, and trade, but at the same time, it was also a breeding ground for countless pathogens. In what seemed like clear blue water, millions of parasites and bacteria thrived, sowing pain upon the human body. The terrifying thing was that, unlike visible enemies such as invaders, disease was an invisible foe. It needed no swords or battles, yet it could destroy entire communities, weaken armies, and even cause dynasties to falter. A pharaoh could be victorious on the battlefield, but be powerless against a racking cough or sores that ate away at his body. Climate, environment, and living conditions. A fertile ground for epidemics. Egypt is situated in a harsh desert region, yet its people concentrated their lives along the Nile. The hot and humid climate, combined with the crowding in urban centers, created ideal conditions for the spread of epidemics. Sanitation systems were almost non-existent. Waste was often dumped directly into the river. Drinking water was taken straight from the Nile. Food was easily contaminated due to the hot weather. Bread, the staple food, was filled with tiny grains of sand, causing the Egyptians' teeth to wear down quickly, creating conditions for rampant dental infections. Furthermore, communal living practices, from religious ceremonies and festivals to warfare, were all opportunities for epidemics to spread. Religion and the mystery of disease. The ancient Egyptians believed that disease came not only from the environment, but also from the wrath of the gods or curses from demons. High fevers, tumors, and ulcers were seen as signs that a person had been punished by the gods. Therefore, healing was not just about taking medicine, but also about performing exorcism rituals, chanting spells and making offerings to the god of medicine, Imhotep, or the goddess Isis. The physician was thus a doctor, a shaman, and an intermediary between the human world and the divine. The mummies, living evidence of disease. Today, when archaeologists excavate mummies, they find abundant evidence of disease. Images of ribs eroded by tuberculosis, skulls deformed by leprosy, blood vessels calcified by arteriosclerosis, and even parasite eggs still present in mummies after more than 3,000 years. These findings make one realize that ancient Egypt not only built immortal pyramids, but was also a place where humans had to constantly struggle with horrifying diseases, full of blood and tears. Why we need to remember. So why today should we remember the diseases that spread fear thousands of years ago? Because the history of medicine always repeats itself. Diseases that were thought to have disappeared, like the plague, smallpox, and tuberculosis, still haunt humanity. And who knows, the ancient viruses locked away in Egyptian mummies might one day escape, bringing a new threat to the modern world. And that is just the first door. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the strange world of ancient Egyptian medicine, where doctors were also sorcerers, where medicine mixed with magic, and where illness was explained not only by science, but also by faith. If there is one thing that makes ancient Egypt special, it is the intersection of rudimentary science and mystical belief. The Egyptians did not view illness merely as a biological phenomenon. To them, it was a sign from the supernatural world, a gateway through which the gods communicated with humans. And it was this belief that shaped a strange medical system, both practical and magical. Physician, doctor, or sorcerer? In ancient Egyptian society, a physician not only prescribed and treated illnesses, but also had to memorize incantations, know how to perform offerings to the gods, and even conduct exorcism rituals. The patient was not only given herbal remedies, but also had to listen to the physician chant spells to drive out evil spirits from the body. For example, a person with a high fever might be diagnosed as the god Seth is burning in the blood. The physician would administer an herbal solution while reciting prayers to the goddess Isis for forgiveness. Medicine and magic were intertwined, inseparable. Medical texts, living proof. What is particularly remarkable is that the Egyptians left behind many medical texts inscribed on papyrus, which have become some of the most precious documents in the history of medicine. Papyrus Ebers, one of the oldest medical documents, containing over 700 remedies for everything from simple headaches to complex conditions, like heart and intestinal diseases. Papyrus Edwin Smith describes traumatic injuries in detail, especially battle wounds, showing a very high level of anatomical knowledge. Kahun Papyrus focuses on women's diseases, childbirth, and menstrual disorders, proving that Egyptian medicine was concerned with reproductive health from a very early stage. What is astonishing is that within these texts, alongside herbal formulas, there are always incantations and prayers to the gods. For the Egyptians, there was no clear demarcation between medicine and magic. Remedies both bizarre and horrifying. The ancient Egyptians were famous for remedies that would make modern people shudder just to hear about them. They used crocodile and cow dung mixed with honey as a contraceptive pessary for women. Bat blood, snake bile, and ground bones were used as amulets to cure children's illnesses. For a toothache, a mixture of brewer's yeast, honey, and human bone ash might be prescribed. For infected wounds, physicians would even place raw meat directly on the wound, inadvertently creating a perfect environment for bacteria to thrive. These remedies may seem horrifying to us, but they also reflect the boldness and creativity of a civilization that had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Beliefs and the role of the gods. In Egyptian belief, every disease was associated with a deity. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who both protected and spread epidemics. It was believed that when Sekhmet was angry, an entire city could fall ill. Isis, the goddess of magic and healing, who was invoked to cure diseases and grant blessings. Imhotep, a high priest and architect, later deified as the god of medicine, a symbol of healing knowledge. Therefore, healing was not just about treating the body, but also about appeasing the anger of the gods. The patient was thus both a sick person and a sinner in need of atonement. Medicine, a part of power. Interestingly, Egyptian medicine was not separate from politics. Pharaohs often had their own personal physicians who were considered treasures of the court. Some famous physicians were even sent to other nations as diplomatic envoys. Controlling medicine also meant controlling the beliefs and fears of the populace. When a pharaoh could declare that the gods will heal through my hands, his power was not only military but also absolute spiritual authority. A world of medical contradictions. In summary, ancient Egyptian medicine was a world full of contradictions. They possessed knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology that was extremely advanced for their time. But at the same time, they still closely tied medicine to magic, charms, and religious beliefs. They had strange remedies, sometimes effective, sometimes unscientific, and sometimes doing more harm than good. And it is from these contradictions that we can see the full picture of a medical system that was both enlightened and superstitious. deeply reflecting how the Egyptian people perceived illness. But everything we have just explored is only the tip of the iceberg. In the next part, we will come face to face with the most terrifying diseases that haunted the ancient Egyptians, from the schistosomiasis, living in their blood vessels, to the blood-coughing tuberculosis, the flesh-eating leprosy, and the great plagues that changed the course of history. If the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the magnificent temples of ancient Egypt are symbols of permanence and power, then beneath that glorious facade lies another world, dark, full of suffering, where disease was an invisible enemy silently claiming thousands of lives. We often think of Egypt as the cradle of civilization, of early medicine, but in reality, the ancient Egyptians had to live in an environment rife with terrible diseases. What is particularly special is that, thanks to the mummies preserved for thousands of years, scientists today can read the history of disease from the very bones and flesh that remain. The results are truly shocking. From powerful pharaohs to humble farmers, no one escaped the siege of horrifying illnesses. 1. Schistosomiasis, the haunting from the sacred river. No disease is more closely associated with Egypt than schistosomiasis. The Egyptians revered the Nile as the river of life, but its waters were also a breeding ground for this fearsome parasite. Simply by stepping into the water, the parasite's larvae could penetrate the skin, travel through the bloodstream to the liver, bladder, and kidneys. The afflicted would begin with a feeling of fatigue, followed by blood in the urine, a phenomenon so common that many ancient texts recorded it. Abdominal pain, an enlarged liver, a bladder infection, and a gradual wasting away of the body would follow. Just imagine a young, healthy farmer carrying water from the Nile every day to irrigate his fields. At first, it's just a few streaks of blood in his urine, but then he grows weaker, his skin turns sallow, and his belly swells. He can no longer work, and his family loses its main laborer. This was the vicious cycle of disease that clung to Egypt for millennia. Mummy examinations show that even the aristocracy, even the pharaohs, were not immune. A civilization nurtured by the Nile, yet simultaneously poisoned by the Nile's schistosomiasis, a haunting paradox. 2. Tuberculosis, the cough echoing in the dark night. One of the clearest pathological signs on the bones of the Egyptians is tuberculosis. Curved spines, deformed ribs, all bear witness. This disease began with a light cough but gradually turned into long days of rasping, dry coughs with blood-tinged phlegm. In the mud brick houses along the river, the sound of coughing echoed everywhere at night, not just the sound of illness, but the call of death. Tuberculosis killed slowly, prolonging the agony. A soldier with TB would lose his fighting strength, a farmer could not go to the fields, and a sick woman was too weak to give birth. Society was eroded not by swords and spears, but by every single cough. The mummies of both nobles and commoners show signs of tuberculosis. In fact, many Egyptologists believe that TB contributed to the weakening of the Egyptian army during several critical historical periods. 3. Leprosy, when humans became living ghosts. If we speak of the disease that sowed the most disgust and fear, it must be leprosy. Those afflicted with leprosy gradually became disfigured. Their faces developed lumps, their skin ulcerated and oozed pus, their noses collapsed, and their limbs became necrotic. In ancient Egyptian society, it was believed that leprosy was a punishment from the gods. Therefore, the afflicted were often shunned and driven out of their communities. They lived a precarious existence in the desert, without family or friends, truly living ghosts. Some mummies found at Thebes show the characteristic bone deformities of leprosy, proving that it once ravaged the society. It is terrifying to think of those sick individuals, their flesh torn and tattered, dragging themselves along the golden sands in despair. 4. The plague, a dark shadow over the city. Although there is no direct archaeological evidence, many Greek and Roman texts describe the plague in Egypt. And if the plague did indeed appear, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Those who contracted the plague usually suffered from high fever, swollen and pus-filled lymph nodes in the groin, extreme bodily pain, and death came within just a few days. In a crowded city like Memphis, even a small outbreak could kill tens of thousands of people. This terror not only claimed lives but also sowed blind fear in people's hearts. At times, people believed it was the wrath of the gods, and the more frantically they made sacrifices, the more they fueled a collective obsession. 5. Smallpox scars etched into history. Many mummies, particularly that of Pharaoh Ramses V, bear the distinct marks of smallpox, a pockmarked face, skin covered in scars. Smallpox not only killed with its high fever, but also left its mark on the survivors. A beautiful Egyptian maiden could become disfigured after a bout of the illness. In a society that worshipped beauty, this was a terrible pain. Smallpox was also extremely contagious. A smallpox epidemic could wipe out entire villages along the river in just a few weeks. The ancient Egyptians, with their rudimentary medicine, were almost powerless against this disease. 6. Worms and parasites, the silent suffering. Besides the deadly epidemics, Egypt was besieged by countless parasites, roundworms, hookworms, and whipworms. Due to poor hygiene and contaminated water sources, Egyptian children often had swollen bellies, were emaciated, and pale. Scientists have found worm eggs in the intestines of many mummies. This indicates that parasites were not a strange disease but a daily affliction. They did not kill quickly but silently drained the life force of an entire nation. 7. Oral infections, the silent killer. It may sound ordinary, but tooth decay in ancient Egypt was a common cause of death. Because bread, the staple food, was often mixed with sand and grit, the Egyptians' teeth were worn down, cracked, and became infected. Many mummies show signs of dental abscesses, with infections spreading to the jawbone. In a society without antibiotics, this meant a slow and painful death. Some pharaohs may have died simply from a toothache. It is ironic that those who held supreme power would fall to such a seemingly minor ailment. 8. Other specific diseases. Eye diseases. The sand-laden winds and harsh sunlight made trachoma and other eye infections common. Many statues and drawings show Egyptians using kohl eyeliner, not just for beauty but also to prevent infection. Malaria. Many mummies show signs of malaria parasite infection. The marshy areas along the Nile were breeding grounds for the disease. Obstetric infections. Egyptian women often died in childbirth due to postpartum infections that the medicine of the time could not treat. A society besieged by disease. These diseases not only killed people but also affected the course of history. Soldiers fell not on the battlefield, but in their thickets. Farmers abandoned their fields due to exhaustion and illness. Nobles and pharaohs, despite living in luxury, could not escape death from seemingly trivial diseases. Ancient Egypt was therefore both a brilliant civilization and a place where people lived under the constant shadow of epidemics. But these diseases did not only cause physical pain. They also left behind immeasurable social consequences, the weakening of the state, collective fear, and bizarre religious rituals and sacrifices to ward off epidemics. Disease in ancient Egypt did not just take lives. It also left deep wounds in society, from religious beliefs and family relationships to politics and power. The Egyptians, with a mindset that always believed in divine intervention, reacted in ways that were both superstitious and practical, creating a picture that was both tragic and strange. 1. Pervasive fear. Whenever an epidemic broke out, the atmosphere in the cities changed to a suffocating degree. The streets were deserted, the markets gloomy. People were afraid to touch each other, afraid to share a water jug, and even afraid of the glance of a sniffling passerby. In the villages along the Nile, many families built earthen fences and hung charms in front of their doors to prevent death from entering. But the barriers were useless. When the epidemic arrived, death still knocked, regardless of whether one was rich or poor. 2. The reaction of the nobility. For the aristocracy, epidemics were a direct threat to the throne. A pharaoh could die from a simple fever, leaving the throne to an unprepared successor. The Egyptian court was shaken many times by the sudden deaths of kings, sparking power struggles. To avoid disease, the nobles often retreated to isolated villas far from the common people. They brought with them physicians, priests, musicians, and slaves, creating oases of power in the desert, hoping to escape the epidemic. But even in flight, they could not escape. Many royal mummies show traces of tuberculosis, leprosy, and even smallpox. 3. Curses and blame. In society, when they could not explain the cause, the Egyptians chose to assign blame. Sometimes, they claimed that a group of foreigners had brought the epidemic. Sometimes, women were accused of witchcraft and driven from their villages. At other times, the sick were considered bearers of a curse, isolated in huts on the edge of the desert, left to die. Some temples even organized rituals of animal sacrifice, and sometimes even slaves to appease the wrath of the goddess Sekhmet. The epidemic, therefore, was not only a physical pain but also became a weapon of discrimination and violence. 4. Hypothetical narrative. The Mother and the Prayer. In the temple of Isis, a mother knelt prostrate on the cold stone floor. Her small child shivered with fever, red spots dotting its skin. The mother offered Isis a small golden statue, the last of her family's possessions. Her tears fell onto her worn linen tunic. She whispered, "Please, goddess Isis, save my child. I vow to dedicate my life to your service." But the child continued to convulse, then took its last breath right before the statue of the goddess. Her cries echoed through the temple, mingling with dozens of other laments. 5. Religion. A place to seek comfort. The greater the epidemic, the more crowded the temples became. People believed that only the gods had the power to free them from the specter of disease. They brought offerings, performed prayers, and often became so desperate that they accepted physical punishments, seeing it as a way to atone for their sins before the gods. In these rituals, we see clearly the powerlessness of humans in the face of nature. Medicine could only cure a few simple ailments. For the rest, everything was left to the gods. For this reason, epidemics further strengthened the spiritual power of religion in Egyptian society. 6. Long-term consequences. The consequences of epidemics were not just death. They also left gaps in the labor force. Fields were abandoned, construction projects were left unfinished, and famine broke out. Many historians argue that during periods of severe epidemics, Egypt's strength waned, making it vulnerable to foreign invasion. This means that those invisible microbes helped change the history of a glorious empire. Epidemics in ancient Egypt did not just destroy the body. They also created a spiritual collapse, spreading fear, discrimination, and even political crises. The Egyptians lived in the shadow of disease, praying to the gods while trying to maintain their lives. If you were to walk into an Egyptian museum today, stand before the mummies of the pharaohs, and look at the linen wrappings around faces worn down by time, you might notice a silence. But that silence is not empty. It contains thousands of cries from the past, physical pain, untimely deaths, and the diseases that haunted Egypt for millennia. For the ancient Egyptians, disease was an invisible abyss. It came suddenly, destroyed without warning, and then quietly disappeared, leaving behind a devastated society. From the Nile River carrying schistosomiasis to the malaria fevers in the swamps, From the horrifying cough of tuberculosis to the disfigured faces of leprosy, all of it painted a dark picture hidden behind the splendor of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Legacy in medicine and history, but it was in that darkness that the Egyptians found ways to fight back. They recorded symptoms, documented remedies, and even dissected corpses to understand the human body better. Although religious belief often overshadowed reason, it was these efforts that sowed the seeds for later medicine. Papyrus scrolls like the Papyrus Ebers and the Papyrus Edwin Smith still exist today, a testament to a people who were both superstitious and hungry for knowledge. Without epidemics, would the Egyptians have been compelled to document so meticulously? Would the medical traditions of Greece, Rome, and then modern Western medicine have found their initial inspiration? A reminder for modern humanity. Looking back at ancient Egypt, it's easy to shudder at the diseases they faced. But perhaps the most frightening thing was not death, but helplessness. The people, whether rich or poor, pharaoh or slave, stood before death with nothing to protect them but their faith in the gods. Today, we have vaccines, medicines, and advanced medical technology. But are we truly safe? The history of Egypt serves as a warning. Epidemics may disappear, but their specter always lurks, waiting for a chance to return. Hasn't the recent global pandemic proven just that? An open ending. Ancient Egypt left us with great pyramids, enduring statues, and also the memory of epidemics. It is a part of the truth that many often forget. Behind the brilliant splendor, there are always dark and painful chapters. And who knows, somewhere in the golden desert sands, there may still be unearthed mummies, carrying within them traces of a disease never before known. A disease that could change how we understand history and even the present. Conclusion. Humanity has come a long way since the time of ancient Egypt, but whenever we face an epidemic, we still tremble, we are still afraid, and we are just as helpless as the people along the Nile so long ago. History, perhaps, is just a cycle, and diseases are one of the ghosts that relentlessly haunt humanity. But is that really the whole story? Or are there still terrifying secrets yet to be revealed, waiting for us to discover in the dust of Egypt?